In this session, we have put together for you 4 specific environmental risk assessments, one for real estate owners and developers, one for commercial contractors, and the last environmental risk assessment we will review is on manufacturers. On the Environmental Strategist website, you have access to over 25 different environmental risk assessments for classes of businesses ranging from municipalities to education facilities, auto dealers, golf courses, transporters, riparian property owners, hunting and fishing clubs, ski resorts, port authorities, tribal nations, and many, many more. The Environmental Risk Assessment is available at estrategist.com in a Microsoft Word format so you can cut and paste it and put it into a presentation that is harmonious with the way you market your business. The Environmental Risk Assessment is broken down into 3 sections. Section 1 reviews potential environmental exposures impacting that specific class of business. Section 2 gives environmental loss examples. And the last section gives an overview of the environmental liability insurance that particular class of business may want to consider as part of their environmental risk transfer strategy. So on page 25, we'll review some of the environmental exposures impacting real estate developers and owners. In the second paragraph, we share some of the environmental exposures, such as former agricultural operations taking place. Agriculture, as we know, is a huge contaminator of our environment. And while agricultural professionals are doing their part to reduce their environmental footprint, historically, farmers ran their operations pretty loose, and the chemicals they used contained heavy metals, which are sinkers and tend to stay on property, versus what they call floaters. That is, they float on groundwater and or mix with groundwater, and so they spread. Heavy metals sink and will stay on the property. Speaking of heavy metals, you can have exposure from historical mining operations. There was a ski area that used water from a stream that ran through their property for snowmaking. The stream was full of old mine tailings that were leaching off contaminants. When they used the stream water to make snow, they were spraying contaminated water on the ski hill. When the snow melted, the resulting stormwater runoff caused other environmental exposures. The ski area was cited by environmental regulators for exacerbating an existing environmental condition. Anywhere historical mining has taken place, you can be pretty assured there will be contamination to deal with. Historical contamination. What about illegal dumping or burial of contaminated materials? Illegal dumping in the United States is a tens of billions $1 a year industry. That's billions with a B. And vacant land is what illegal dumpers look for. So while someone that owns a vacant piece of land feels they do not have an environmental exposure, what if someone illegally disposes of waste on vacant land? If you do not catch who did it, and even if you do catch who did it, if you can't pay to clean up the problem, the owner of the property under federal law is ultimately responsible for the environmental condition of their property. In one example, used tires were showing up in large numbers on a vacant piece of land. Security cameras were set up, and what they found was one of the local tire dealers was charging customers $5 a tire for used tire disposal, and the tire dealer was pocketing the money and illegally disposing of used tires on vacant land. Illegal dumping, vapor intrusion, stormwater runoff, all of these can cause pollution from neighboring properties. What's nice with vapor intrusion, stormwater runoff, sick building syndrome is for businesses that claim they do not have an environmental exposure. You can agree with them and say, for sake of discussions, let's say you do not have an environmental exposure, but who are your neighbors? And what if they cause an environmental exposure to impact your property and they cannot have the financial wherewithal to take care of it? In that case, you're now the owner of a piece of contaminated property. Remember, in Phase 1 site assessments, they do a 2-mile radius search to see if neighbors within a 2-mile radius have contamination that can come onto your property. Use the websites listed on page 12 of your training manual under the EPA to do a search of your clients to let them know if anyone in their 2-mile radius is contaminating and can it impact them. These websites are not only great for generating business opportunities, but also to conduct environmental strategist due diligence so you can let a business know who their neighbors are. How can a business make an informed decision if they do not know who their neighbors are? As the environmental strategist, one service you perform is to find out who your client's neighbors are. Another exposure is natural resource damages. What about impacting easements that cross the property, like underground utilities, such as oil, natural gas, sewers, and much more? If you have property with elevators, you can have leaks from the elevator hydraulic fluid storage tanks. And these elevator storage tanks could be 40 to 60 gallons per elevator. Impacting wetlands or endangered species. Remember, there are roughly 1,200 endangered species in the United States, and you do not have to own the land the endangered species are on. If you are a neighboring property to one containing an endangered species, and if your operations can impact an endangered species, you can have a real problem. You can have corrosion in wastewater sewers that can cause for leaks. We continually hear in our country how dilapidated our infrastructure is and how it needs to be repaired and in many cases replaced, so that means it's more susceptible to an environmental loss. Excavating through and spreading of unknown pre-existing contaminated soil. Impacting groundwater from drilling and excavation work. Old and or unknown leaking underground storage tanks. Remember, in the United States, we have 400,000 known leaking underground storage tanks. What about no auditing of waste handling and disposal companies? As we know, you own your manifested waste from cradle to grave, so you want to make sure whoever is jockeying your waste down the road is qualified to do so with equipment that is properly maintained. As your client's environmental strategist, you can check this off the list because this is another service you offer, inspecting your client's vendors. As a side story, I live in a county, or as referred to in Louisiana, a parish, where we have a traffic light in the entire county. A few years ago, a nationally recognized waste hauler received a traffic citation for not having a commercially licensed driver operating their waste truck. Now, if that can happen in my little county with a traffic light, what is going on in larger metropolitan markets? Who are you doing business with? Do you have a real estate owner with tenants that can store and use environmentally sensitive materials, chemicals, or waste? What about tenants that leave raw environmentally sensitive materials behind when they vacate the building? Remember we talked about illicit abandonment? Is there an environmental indemnification in force with the tenant indemnifying the building owner in the lease agreement? What is their financial assurance strategy should the tenant cause an environmental liability or illicit abandonment? The time to answer that question is before the environmental loss occurs. I would suggest at the time the lease is signed. How about spills of fuels, oils, chemicals brought onto the property? When you have vendors that come onto a client's property, what kind of environmental exposures can they create? Vandalism. If vandals cause an environmental loss, the property owner is ultimately responsible for the environmental condition of the property. Sick building syndrome is a big exposure for any building owner, especially one that has third parties that can come onto their property like employees, students, tenant, general public. New tenants in buildings oftentimes remodel, and in the process, the VOCs, off-gassing from the paint and carpet glue, can get into buildings' heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system and cause people in other parts of the building to get sick. Mold, asbestos, and lead, loading and unloading products, materials from trucks, railroads, barges, aircraft. And if they are doing this over unsealed ground, above ground or underground storage tanks, adverse reactions and interactions of chemical compounds that accidentally commingle during a fire. Janitorial supplies. I love to hear people when they tell me they only use environmentally friendly chemicals. To which I say, what happens when one environmentally friendly product accidentally gets introduced to another environmentally friendly product and mixed together, they do not make an environmentally friendly product. So the first section to the ERA, we go through outlining potential environmental exposures. Obviously, we do not cover all of the environmental exposures, but you can see there is a cornucopia of environmental exposures impacting real estate owners and developers. The second part of our environmental risk assessment is designed to educate businesses on their environmental exposures utilizing loss examples. Loss example number 1. A real estate developer placed a new building on the site of a former parking lot. During excavation, petroleum hydrocarbon contamination was discovered. Cleanup costs exceeded $700,000. Had the developer had a property transfer policy, this could have covered their loss. Environmental loss example number 2. A real estate investment trust owns several parcels of vacant land in a remote area. When the owner and contractor visited the site to begin construction, they discovered that several piles of unidentified waste had been illegally dumped on the property. The owner had the piles tested at a cost of several $1,000s. The piles were determined to contain hazardous waste, and at the owner's cost to dispose of it exceeded $250,000. An environmental impairment liability policy could have addressed this environmental exposure. Again, I point out that illegal disposal of waste in this country is a tens of billions of dollars a year industry, and any clients you have with vacant land need a strategy to address this environmental exposure. Also, storm sewers or sewer systems are convenient to illegally dispose of waste. Example number 7. While clearing a construction site for a new shopping mall, the building contractor followed routine procedures by hauling construction debris to a local landfill. Later, when neighbors close to the landfill complained about a strange odor, it was discovered that the debris contained hazardous materials. The municipality sued the developer for cleanup costs, which the court awarded in the amount of $1.2 million. Contractors' pollution liability insurance could have covered this exposure. Loss example number 12. A real estate owner hired an electrical contractor to upgrade a building's electrical system. During trenching operations, a backhoe hit a natural gas pipeline, causing an explosion. Third parties filed bodily injury claims against the contractor as well as the property owner whose building was destroyed in the explosion. Claims exceeded $2.5 million. Either contractor's pollution liability or environmental impairment liability coverage could have covered this loss. Loss example number 14. A commercial real estate owner was subject to defense costs exceeding $25,000, in addition to property damage and bodily injury claims exceeding $400,000 from a neighboring residential community. During sewage installation, a subcontractor improperly tied in piping. This caused raw sewage to migrate into the underlying groundwater and contaminate residential wells. Contractors' pollution liability coverage could have covered this exposure. This is just another good example of making sure you know who you're doing business with. Here we offer a simple, brief explanation on risk transfer strategies. In this section specifically, environmental liability insurance that real estate developers and owners may want to consider as part of their business model. So on page 29, you will see the first insurance real estate owners and developers should consider is environmental impairment liability coverage, which is, as we know, is site-specific coverage and can protect the insured for pre-existing unknown and new environmental liabilities, such as first-party on-site cleanup, third-party bodily injury, third-party property damage, transportation pollution liability, and much more. Remember, for real estate owners with multiple locations, we can bulk them onto one policy, so they blanket coverage and the locations share the limits, but they also share the premium, so it brings down the per location cost. For businesses more interested in protecting themselves against the environmental shock loss, they should consider EIL coverage on a multi-year term. Keep in mind, on the multi-year term, you share the limits for an entire policy period. You do not get a new set of limits every 12 months. However, you do get a nice premium discount for sharing the limits. It's very common for an environmental risk transfer transaction to go from initial meeting with the insured trying to convince you and themselves they do not have any environmental exposures to where you share with them an environmental risk assessment to get on the same page about their environmental exposures. So now they realize they need to make an environmental liability insurance part of their business model, but they want to keep it cheap as they can, so you offer them a multi-year term policy, and all of a sudden they need to double the limits being offered because they need to make sure they have enough to cover their environmental loss. And you ask them about keeping premiums low, and they say they want to make sure they have enough to cover them, so they feel it's a good investment and sound business decision to make environmental liability insurance part of their business model. Guess who is their trusted advisor and strategic partner? That's right, you, their environmental strategist.